Good to see you all here today. We're beginning our new semester, new classes all around. If you're here, then you are here for 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians when we get this wrapped up. But I imagine the next 6 months, we'll need every week of those 6 months, every class to get through 1 and 2 Corinthians. These two letters are not only lengthy compared to the rest of the epistles of the New Testament, they're also very weighty. There's a lot of meat in these letters. We've got a lot of challenging concepts to tackle, a lot of teachings and instructions from Paul that we're going to have to sift through what it meant to its original audience and try and understand it in its context before we can make sense of it today. And so there's a lot of challenges with 1 Corinthians because this is a church that had challenges, that had problems, and there's a lot that Paul is trying to fix. So this morning, we're simply going to introduce the text. I doubt we'll even get into the text much at all this morning. I just want to talk about the origins of this congregation, how it got started when the gospel was first brought to Corinth, understand a little bit about the location, a little bit about the culture, the geography, and the history of the city. That will help us understand some of the things we'll read in these letters that Paul is dealing with. We sort of profile first century Corinth. And then after we wrap up 1 Corinthians, we go right into 2 Corinthians. It's made as companion books, one right after the other. So that's what this whole semester is going to look like. So let's just begin. And as far as homework is concerned for next week, what I'd like for you to do is read 1 Corinthians in one sitting, just beginning to end. And this is the most valuable thing I think you can do, particularly with New Testament. I get it. I'm not going to ask you necessarily to do that with Job for Wednesday night class, though I think that would be a good exercise too. I understand that's asking a lot more. So a lot of these Old Testament books, they're a little more suited to break up into pieces. But New Testament letters, I just want you to imagine what it would be like in the first century. We don't have this. It's not sitting on our pew. It's not in our hands. It's not in our phones, in our pocket, everywhere we go. We are still getting revelation. We are still getting instruction from apostles and from prophets and teachers. And so imagine in the first century, you are in this church and a letter from Paul shows up. There's a high likelihood you are not able to read it yourself. For one, there's not copies readily available to be passed around and distributed, no photocopier. And a lot of people simply couldn't read in the first century anyway. So this letter, which just arrived, would be read before the congregation. That would be your first encounter with this letter from the Apostle Paul, is having it read out loud in your hearing with everyone else there. And I can't believe that whoever it is that was in charge, one of the elders or a preacher or evangelist, I can't imagine the one charged with getting up and reading it to the congregation would read through the first 12 verses and say, that's enough for today. Come back next week and we'll read a little bit more into this first chapter, which it wasn't in chapters in the first century. When they got this letter, it was read beginning to end for everyone to hear. That's how it was intended to be read. Now, we're going to study it in smaller pieces over the next 3-4 months. But to understand and appreciate the weight of this letter, I think that's the best way to experience it, is to read it in one sitting, beginning to end. And that's a good practice for anything in the New Testament. Revelation, that was a huge help for me. See the big picture. And then it kind of makes sense when I start looking at the smaller bits, because you miss the forest for all the trees. So I'd encourage you to do that with 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians when you're done reading this. Take an opportunity, maybe even read it out loud as if you are reading it to the church. That might be a good way to get yourself in the mindset of the original audience of this letter. So when we look at the city of Corinth, we need to understand that it doesn't take much to look at the map and see why this was such an important city. So first of all, it was a very wealthy city. And it was a very old city. This is 2,000 years ago when we're reading these letters. But even at that point, it was an old city. It was a Greek city, conquered by the Romans, and then rebuilt as a Roman colony. But the way most historians characterize it, even though Rome conquered the world, Greece conquered Rome from a cultural standpoint. And so this is a very old city, but it was also a very wealthy city. Some of the figures I've heard suggest that at its height, there could have been 200,000 residents and up to 500,000 slaves. So 750,000 people in this ancient city. So it was a very large city, but it was also very prosperous. And all you have to do is just glance at the map. And you can see right here, this thin little strip of land that connects this northern region of Macedonia with Achaia in the south. These two land masses of Greece are connected right here by this thin little strip, this, and I always have a hard time saying this, isthmus is what it was called. So all of the commerce that went across land that was traveling from north to south or south to north, it would pass right through Corinth. But also, when you're looking at it, down here to the south, this had a reputation not too dissimilar from the reputation around the Cape Horn. Incredibly dangerous to go around. There's lots of islands. The weather's unpredictable. It was very dangerous sailing. So to save not only the risk of sinking your ship, but also it took a long time. It was hundreds of miles to go around. What they would do is they would come from the west over here and then go to Corinth, and this is only about 4 miles across from this port on the west. I forget the name of it, but then Cenchrea, we recognize that name. That's where Paul cut his hair. That's probably the only thing you associate it with. In Cenchrea, I cut my hair because I was keeping a vow. Well, it's this little port town on the east side of Corinth, and so from one end to the other was only 4 miles. So smaller boats would be taken up out of the water, put on rollers, and they'd go across this 4 miles. Larger ships, they would just take the cargo off and do the same procedure. So it sounds a little bit labor intensive, but when you think about the alternative is sailing around very dangerous waters, it saved a lot of time and resources and lives. So that's the way they did it. So the result is all of the commerce from north to south or from east to west, it all passed through Corinth. And that made this an incredibly wealthy city. Now you can start to understand already how that would cause problems. I'm already way behind in my slides. So we think wealth is the answer to all problems, where it's probably much more likely the case that wealth is the cause of most of our problems. At least there's that relationship of cause and effect with wealth. And so Corinth, incredibly wealthy, also incredibly cosmopolitan. It's an incredibly cosmopolitan city. It's made up of people from all over the world. It's represented... Let's see, one historian said Greeks, Latins, Syrians, Asiatics, Egyptians, and Jews bought and sold, labored and reveled, quarreled and hobnobbed in its cities and ports like nowhere else in Greece. So it was just geographically located at the perfect place. And again, it was a very ancient city going back to some 500 years before Christ and before the book of Acts that we read about. It was destroyed by the Romans around 146 BC, but then it was rebuilt and refounded in 44 BC by Julius Caesar as a Roman colony. And so it was not ruled over by military government like Syria, which is the region of the Roman Empire that had Jerusalem in it. So Pontius Pilate was more of a military governor. This was governed by the Roman Senate. So this was more of a peaceful territory that was part of Rome, not an occupied territory that needed military presence. And again, very, very cosmopolitan in its mixture. As far as reputation goes, there was a lot of, with money passing through, there were other things that went on there too. There was a lot of immorality associated with this town. In fact, it had sort of a reputation like Sodom, where we call it sodomy, named after the place. And Corinth had a bit of that reputation as well. It was known to live as Corinthian, meant to live in luxury and immorality. So that came with it, hand in hand. And when you think about the religious atmosphere as well, they've uncovered many special places, religious places, temples. The most notable would be the temple of Aphrodite, which is said to have 1,000 prostitutes. Now that's probably hyperbole or an exaggeration, but that's what it was known for. Well, I think that's the next slide up there. So that's largely what it's known for. What are some of the highlights in the letter? Let me turn it around to you guys and ask a question now. Of the warnings that Paul gives, how can you see this side of Corinth coming through to the church and affecting the way they think, the way they behave? What are some of the big warnings that Paul gives in this letter? What are some of the issues that he addresses that you recall?
Proud that one of their members was actually living with his father's wife.
Yeah, so they boasted that's a very immoral situation, and that's going to be a big section of this book, chapter 5, and Paul was told about that. Paul was hearing things about them. There is one thing among many that Paul has to address in this letter. What are some other issues that seem to reflect this Corinthian ideology? Yeah, we see that 1 Corinthians 11, we focus on the Lord's Supper, but there does seem to be some secondary indications from that text that there was also economic disparity between the haves and the have-nots. What does the first chapter reveal about the makeup of this church? What kind of attitude is there? Do they get along well? Is this church solidified together? Are they harmonious? Divisions, and there's a lack of unity there. And this gets into another kind of a Corinthian ideology, the idea of the patron, where you have teachers and they have patrons that pay them, and so you get these wise teachers that have their schools and people are paying them, and that was a pretty prestigious thing if you had a large group of disciples and wealthy patrons. So that was sort of the Corinthian way of looking at philosophy and religion, is you found your guru, you found your teacher, your master, and you went to school and learned from him. I'm of Paul, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Apollos. They're doing exactly what Corinthian society did. And there's some indication, we'll talk about a little bit later, that they looked down at Paul for some of those reasons, that Paul didn't look like one of their teachers. They were trying to take these leaders in the church and treat them like the philosophers. And the fact that Paul was always poor, always struggling, and didn't really seem to be much of an orator. And that's one criticism we'll see, I think it's in the second letter. Oh, well, his letters are weighty, but his presence is unimpressive. That he writes a big letter, but when he's here in person, he's not a good speaker. So that's one way they criticize Paul, and that fits with the Corinthian mindset as well, that they were looking at these leaders in the church and just trying to follow the pattern of Corinthian society. Find your teacher, find your master, pay them money, and the richest, most wealthiest ones, they got to be the best ones. And Paul just didn't fit that mold.
Would you say there was reliance on worldly wisdom?
Yes, and so you're going to see that in this, I think it's the beginning of the second letter, when he talks about the wisdom of God compared to the foolishness of man, that the world would look at the cross as foolishness, but it is the wisdom of God revealed. So there is very much of that. And when he talks about at the end of 1 Corinthians with the resurrection, there is a lot of dependence upon their own wisdom to understand things. And with that as well, there's this misunderstanding that the body is entirely evil. And this was very prevalent among first century philosophers. The body is filthy, evil, irredeemable, unclean, and your spirit just can't wait to be separated from it. And that's why they had such a difficulty reconciling the resurrection. Well, Jesus was resurrected, and he wasn't just a disembodied spirit floating around. He was resurrected bodily. They recognized him. And so Paul had to address some of that idea that the body isn't a bad thing. And that's where you get this idea that why sexual immorality was so rampant. Because the body is irredeemably bad, so it doesn't matter what you do with your body. And Paul argues, no, it really does matter. And your body is going to be resurrected. So it's important how you use your body and do not use it for sinful things like joining with a temple harlot. So there is a lot of worldly wisdom that they are depending upon and leaning upon. Go ahead.
So they would be parallel to our society in terms
I think
of all the academics, the worldly knowledge of professors kind of look down their nose at that common.
yes, I think there is a lot of great parallel to modern cities today, like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, New York. You take some of the biggest cities that have, especially on the West Coast, these cities were put on the map by their geographical location, much like Corinth. They are known for being very cosmopolitan, a lot of diversity in these big cities, but also you have like Hollywood, you have the film industry, you have a lot of money coming in, but that affects the way they think and the way they look at religion and criticize religion. So I think there is a lot of great parallel to modern cities. So that's just a little bit. I'm not the best historian. I should probably have Scott come back in and pinch hit for me on the history side, Scott Willie. But that's the best I can do on a little bit of the history of Corinth. But we can talk more scripture about the origins of this church in just a moment. But go ahead, Mike. Yeah. I think that's why they would look down on Paul, is he didn't match up with those teachers. And so the modern equivalent would be like that. We put a lot of stock, and I'm not going to bash PhDs or anything like that, but as a society, we put a lot of stock in those. Right, and he's going to lean into that Jesus appeared to me. I'm a witness of his resurrection. I have firsthand experience with Jesus, so that makes me uniquely qualified. And he's going to have to defend his apostleship a little bit throughout these letters. So when we talk about the church and some of the origins where this church popped up, you don't need to see this map in too much detail, but just as a... Oops. Backwards. Okay. Nope. No, go back. Sorry. It's a double click thing. I want zoom. There we go. Okay. So on his second missionary journey, he heads off and goes back to some of the churches he went to on his first trip, strengthening them. But that's when he has the Macedonian vision and crosses over up here into Macedon and goes to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, has some success there, but that's where the Jews are following him and persecuting him, and it drives him further south as he keeps going down this way until he gets into Athens, and then eventually Corinth would be his next stop, and there's that bottleneck right there on the isthmus. I said it right that time. So this is where the church has its origins. I just want to put the map up there to remind you. And then Paul on his third journey comes back to Ephesus and spends 2 years there, and that's where this letter was written. It seems evident. So open up your Bibles to Acts chapter 17 really quick. As you look through these first couple journeys of Paul, stayed pretty close to Asia Minor at first. But this journey begins towards the end of chapter 15. They have the separation between Paul and Barnabas regarding John Mark. And so Paul takes Silas, and so he goes off on his way. Chapter 16, he's going through these churches he had previously visited. Timothy is added to the group here in chapter 16 and converted and starts following them. As well as in Troas, chapter 16, verses 8 and 9, that's where you see this shift in the narrative where Luke starts saying, then we went here and we did this. So it becomes apparent that Luke joins the team there in Troas, and this is when chapter 17 is when you have that message, that vision that he has of the Macedonians saying, come and preach to us. So he crosses over in chapter 16, and so chapter 16 is Philippi and the Philippian jailer and a lot of familiar stories, having success, but the Jews keep running him out of town. So we get to chapter 18, and that's where he goes from Athens. And you notice when he gets into Greece, Athens must have been frustrating. Look at the last verse of chapter 17. So Paul departed from among them. However, some men joined him and believed. Among them Dionysius the Areopagite, a woman named Damaris, and others with them. So he got a few followers from Athens, but largely he was rejected. They were disinterested there. And I find it curious, the dynamic between Athens, where they worshiped philosophy. They were just looking for some new thing, some new teaching they had never heard before. But they couldn't get interested in what Paul was saying. It just wasn't new enough for them. It wasn't different enough. It wasn't engaging enough. So Paul got really no traction in Athens at all. But then he comes to Corinth where they worship immorality. And he stays there for 1.5 years. I just find that curious. And I like to ask those questions. Why was he shut out in Athens, where they're philosophers, but had great success in Corinth, where there's all this immorality? Just my 2 cents worth as I ponder these kinds of questions is I think in Corinth he found people that maybe knew they had problems, maybe knew they were sinners. And I think a lot of people look at the West Coast that way, that it's an immoral place. And whenever I go back to Florida or Texas and talk to people and tell them, I never lived somewhere where I get so many Bible studies with people. And they're kind of surprised to hear that. I said, well, you go to the South, everyone goes to church, and they all think they're saved, and many of them are lost because they're ignorant of the truth, but they go to church just enough to think they're saved. But out here, I think you get a lot of people that know they're missing something. And I think some of that might be what's going on between Athens and Corinth. But as he goes through in Acts chapter 18, the first several verses there, he meets Priscilla and Aquila. And this helps us get a little bit of a date and timing here, because it says Priscilla and Aquila were kicked out of Rome because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. That happened about 49 AD, right around there, 4950 AD. And we actually have the Roman historian Suetonius has a quote where he talks about this was done by Claudius because the Jews were constantly instigating problems over someone he identifies as Chrestus. Now, the theory is that that's just a misunderstanding or misspelling of the Christ, and that makes sense because Romans didn't understand. They didn't differentiate early on between Jew and Christian. They're just Jews fighting over two sects of the Jewish religion, fighting over something we don't understand. So that happened in 49 AD. So he meets Priscilla and Aquila, and Paul is making tents because he has to support himself there until Silas and Timothy catch up, and they're able to bring some support from Macedonia, some of those churches up there. And that's going to be a major theme in Corinth as well, the issue of whether Paul takes pay from them or not. We'll elaborate on that more. So we get the early converts here in Acts chapter 18. He starts in the synagogue, and again, very cosmopolitan city, so there was a large Jewish population. And in the first century, many of these major cities like Alexandria or Rome or Corinth, they might have had populations of Jews that exceeded the population of Jerusalem itself. So there were more Jews abroad than living in Judea or Jerusalem in the first century, is what seems to be indicated when you read history books. So he begins in the synagogue, hits a brick wall, so he starts going to the Gentiles and has big success. So he says in Acts chapter 18, verse 11, he continued there for a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. And then we get Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. This is another key factor that helps us put a date, roughly, to the book of 1 Corinthians. There are historical references that have been found, archaeological discoveries, if you will, that have inscriptions of Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia. And we can put a date to it at about 51 AD. So if Paul was in Corinth for about a year and a half, around 50 to 51 AD, and then he goes home, comes back on his third journey, and stops in Ephesus for 2 years, and that's clearly where this letter was written from, that puts us around 55, roughly, 55 AD. That's when this letter would have been written, because Paul was here around 50 to 51 AD, stayed for a year and a half, and then journeyed back to Jerusalem, Antioch, and all the way to Ephesus before he wrote this letter, and was at Ephesus for 2 years. So anywhere in that 2-year time span is when Paul would have written this letter. So as we go through the chapter, Paul has great success, stayed there for a year and a half, and then when it's time for him to leave, we're introduced to Apollos, and that's one of the people that the Corinthians attached themselves to, because Apollos was a very eloquent man. Compared to Paul, he probably looked the part better than Paul. And he was very strong in the scriptures, and after some instruction from Priscilla and Aquila, they met him at Ephesus. He went to Corinth. So it says in chapter 19 and verse 1, it happened while Apollos was at Corinth that Paul, having passed through the upper regions, came to Ephesus. And that's the beginning of Paul's 2-year stay in Ephesus. So Apollos spent some time in Corinth as well, and so he was a very significant figure in their early years as a congregation. And as I pointed out earlier, it was a church that was very divided. Look at 1 Corinthians 12 for just a moment. I think the cosmopolitan makeup of the city is reflected in the church itself. Because we noted that in Acts chapter 18, Paul begins at the synagogue, so there was a large Jewish population there, and there are hints throughout the letter. There are hints throughout the letter that Paul is dealing with not just Gentile Christians, but that there would be Jews in this church as well. So in 1 Corinthians 12 and verse 13, for by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and have all been made to drink into one Spirit. So he kind of talks about some economic differences. There was a large, like I said, 200,000 inhabitants, 500,000 slaves is what many people estimate. So when he talks about slave and free, that's a big difference among church members here as well. And then he talks about Jew and Gentile. So I think the church, and some of the names mentioned here, this was kind of interesting to just look at all the names mentioned throughout the letter. That also gives us a little bit of an indication. We have 3 that are likely Jewish, Priscilla, Aquila, and Crispus. even though those are Latin names, but we understand Peter, Simon, Cephas, the idea of having a Jewish name and a Greek name or a Latin name, that's not uncommon. So those three are Jewish, even though they have more Latin names. 3 or 4 others have Latin names, but are probably Roman. So Fortunatus, Quartus, Gaius, and Titius Justus. Those would be probably Roman. And then at least 1 or 2 would seem to be wealthier members, Gaius and Titius Justus. They seem to be wealthy people. And then the rest are Greek names, Stephanus, Achaicus, Erastus. So just wanted to point out that I think this church is going to be very, very mixed bag as far as the members that make up the group here. And that's why unity is going to be such a huge part and emphasis in these letters. What's the reason for the letter to be written? Why did Paul write this letter? What was the occasion for it? Sorry? Divisions. Why did Paul choose to, how does he know about this? I guess let me rephrase that. What prompted him to write this letter? He addresses division first and foremost, but what prompted him to do that? He heard disturbing news. So from Chloe's people, I don't know who Chloe's people are, that's a mystery, but someone that he trusts came and told him, there's divisions. This church is fracturing, splintering. What are some other things? It was already mentioned earlier, but what's another thing that came to Paul's attention? Was told to him. Chapter 5, what's the situation there? Incest. Guy with his father's wife. Gentiles don't even do that. You're bringing reproach on the name of Christ. So there's a number of distressing things and information that has been brought to his attention. That's the occasion for this letter. It isn't just that they needed some encouragement or that they needed further instruction. He'd been there for a year and a half. Outside of Ephesus, this seems to be the longest stay of any location for Paul. A year and a half here, 2 years in Ephesus, but he spent a lot of time with this church. So I feel like, and then with Apollos showing up, they should be pretty well grounded. So he's not writing to ground them more firmly or give them more instruction. This letter is largely corrective and reactive in nature. He's heard disturbing things about them. Now the letter, again, was written from Ephesus. We know that because Apollos was there. But he also says as much, if you look at chapter 16, Apollos was there, but he leaves by the time this letter is written. Chapter 16, notice verses 8 and 9, first of all. But I will tarry in Ephesus until Pentecost, which would be in the springtime. For a great and effective door is opened to me, and there are many adversaries. Well, just read Acts chapter 19, and you understand he was having great success, but then the city eventually erupted in a riot. A mob broke out. And so he did have many adversaries there, but that's why he stayed for 2 years. It was a very effective place evangelistically. And that's where he's writing this letter from. And we already noted from chapter 19 and verse 1 of Acts that Apollos was there. But if you're still in 1 Corinthians 16, look at verse 12. Now concerning our brother Apollos, I strongly urged him to come to you with the brethren. But he was quite unwilling to come at this time. However, he will come when he has a convenient time. I'm assuming Apollos was similarly occupied with evangelism somewhere else and told Paul, I've got a good thing going wherever he was. But it doesn't tell us his reason why he was unwilling to go to Corinth. But that does tell us that Paul looked favorably on Apollos. I strongly urged him to come to you. Apollos needs to be there. So the fact that some people were lining up behind Apollos isn't apparently because Apollos was promoting himself. The problem isn't with Apollos, it's with the Corinthians. So that gives us a little bit of understanding about when this letter was written while he was in Ephesus, and it appears that Apollos has left, and that maybe is when the problems really started to take effect. Another quirk about this, we say 1 Corinthians. This probably is not 1 Corinthians. It seems to be indicated in several places that this is not the first letter that Paul has written to this church. Similarly, and this is one of the challenges of 1 and 2 Corinthians, we are reading half of a correspondence. We're only reading one half of the conversation. So we're left to fill in some of the blanks and try and assume what the questions and what things were being sent to Paul. What questions were the Corinthian church sending to Paul in letters? Because we don't have the letters from Corinth to Paul. But if we just look at a couple of these scriptures here, chapter 5 and verse 9, for example. I wrote to you in my letter not to keep company with sexually immoral people. Well, that would be the first Corinthians that he's talking about, right? So it seems like, and the Bible doesn't hide this fact, that there are many things that could have been written, volumes could have been written, but that would be burdensome. And there are plenty of letters that were passed around. We can't believe that these handful of letters is all of the correspondence that the apostles ever wrote. But what we have is, I believe, what God intended for us to have is a collection of writings for our benefit, and it is everything we need to be disciplined unto godliness and be fully mature in our faith. But yes, there are a lot of things that were written that don't exist today, or just memory. And so we get this reference here. And similarly in chapter 7, verse 1, now concerning the things of which you wrote to me. And then, I don't know if I want to get into this now. I'll probably save this for our introduction of 2 Corinthians. But when you get into 2 Corinthians, it seems like Paul made a abrupt and maybe hasty trip to Corinth. It sounds like this letter, maybe delivered by Timothy, was not received very well. In fact, look at 1 Corinthians 16 now that I think about it. Look at this reference to Timothy here in 1 Corinthians 16. There it is, verse 10. 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 10. And if Timothy comes, see that he may be with you without fear. Why would he need to say that? Why wouldn't they welcome Timothy? Why would Timothy be afraid to go to them? Because there was a large group of anti-Paul people at Corinth, is what it seems like. And so Paul, it sounds like this letter was not very well received. And when we look at 2 Corinthians, it seems like he took a quick trip, probably from Ephesus, because it would be a fairly short boat ride from Ephesus across. And that visit did not go well. And so he did a 180 really quick and said, I made a mistake. I shouldn't have come here. And so this letter might not have been received well. And in his desire to fix the situation, he went, and that visit didn't go well. And so in 2 Corinthians, there's several spots we'll look at when we get there where he talks about, this is now the third time I am coming to you. Well, we don't read about the middle trip anywhere else. It's only mentioned there in 2 Corinthians. And he talks about, I'm not going to come to you in sorrow again, meaning his second visit would have been a sorrowful visit. So I just wanted to point out, there's a lot going on that isn't recorded. There's other letters that were written from Paul to Corinth, and of course we know there's letters from them to Paul. And we have answers to questions, so we can sort of piece together what the questions they were asking. But that is one thing that sort of complicates how this book is interpreted. So Paul is addressing these problems, and we already mentioned the division in chapter 1, the divisiveness, they're following different teachers. We noted that there's another issue in chapter 5 that was brought to his attention But also, as I pointed out, chapter 7, the second half of the letter is Paul answering a lot of their questions. So, chapter 7, concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. And then he gets into some questions about, chapter 7 is going to be a fun discussion, I'll just say that. Trying to understand what question is he addressing here specifically. Is it possible that there's some overcorrection, that the Corinthians, being so sexually immoral and having this view of the body as being irredeemably wicked and evil, and so doesn't matter? Is there some overcorrection that you should be celibate, and if you're married, you should divorce your spouse because celibacy is better? Is he addressing questions like that? So that's kind of how this letter works, is we see that he's answering a question they submitted, but we have to guess a little bit at what the specific question was. Chapter 8, now concerning things offered to idols. And so chapters 8, 9, and 10, that's a big part of Corinthian culture. There were temples everywhere. There were markets where the animals and meat sacrificed would be sold. And also there were dining halls in these temples. And so you would eat a meal in dedication to the god of that temple. And so that's part of Corinthian culture that now has been brought into the church, and they have questions about it. What part of this do we avoid? What part is... So that's chapters 8, 9, and 10. Chapter 12, concerning spiritual gifts. And that's pretty important here. This church was loaded with spiritual gifts. But just having blessings like that did not make them a solid or strong church. They had gifts, they had blessings, they had resources, but they weren't using them properly. And so he's going to have to address some of those issues. So those are the kinds of questions that he's dealing with here in this letter. He writes chapter 15 about the resurrection, chapter 16 now concerning the collection for the saints. And that's a big deal too. So just a little preview of what's coming up in this letter. That's the last slide there. All right, any questions, comments, observations about 1 Corinthians? Go to chapter 6. Let's spend our last... go ahead, Jessica. Oh, yes. Can I put the last slide up, Joe? So if we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 6, I think this is one of the strongest warnings, but it also helps us understand what was going on in the culture that had made its way into the church. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Do any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? He's criticizing them for taking each other to courts of law. Now remember, Corinth was a city of commerce, very money-driven. A lot of wealth, but there was a larger number of slaves than free people there. So you have economic disparity. So you're going to have quarreling over all the money that's passing through here. And he says, don't bring that in the church. It's not a good look for us to be seen by the people outside the church. It's not a good look for them to see us quarreling over money and wealth and possessions. So verse 5, I say this to your shame, that you're taking one another to a court of law. So that is, again, the character of this letter. It's a corrective response to many problems this church has. So I'm writing to shame you. Shame is not a bad thing when there's a genuine problem that needs to be corrected. Verse 8, no, you do yourselves wrong and cheat, and you do these things to your own brethren. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor homosexuals, nor sodomites, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners will inherit the kingdom of God. And such were some of you. He talks about how Jesus sanctified them and cleansed them from those sins, but we look at that list and think that's a pretty horrifying list of unrighteousness. But he says that's what you were. That's what Corinth was like. All of these characteristics here were rampant in Corinthian culture. There was extortion. There was the rich getting richer and ripping other people off. There was taking advantage of other people. There was rampant sexual immorality. And when we continue on, it seems like the second half of chapter 6, he's addressing the temple harlots. Verse 13, food is for the stomach and the stomach for foods, but God will destroy both, it and them. Now the body is not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. So again, he's correcting their misunderstandings about the body and its function. And God both raised up the Lord and also will raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the member of Christ and make them members of a harlot? Certainly not. So you can sort of infer that this was still problematic in the church in Corinth. Old habits. Going to the temple of Aphrodite, joining yourself with the harlot, and he's saying that you can't just look at your body as irredeemably bad and go ahead and sin all you want with it, because it's a member of Christ, and you can't join that member to a harlot. So I just wanted to finish there in 1 Corinthians 6 with that description of the sins that characterized the city and still were affecting the church. Any final questions, comments, observations? All right. Oh, go ahead, Kay. Well, I think there was a Jewish population there, but I would guess the majority of this church would be Gentile, and they probably needed reminding of those kinds of lessons, that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for those same kinds of sins. But I think to the Greek and Roman audience there, they probably didn't think much about those stories. So yeah, for next week, read the whole book, and we'll start in chapter 1. Thank you.